Good morning and welcome to our fourth Parents Forum Finance. Today, we're asking about the financial implications of moving out or staying put in London. There are many reasons why we think about moving out of London. Perhaps we want more space, or we want a more rural education for our children, or simply a different pace of life. Some of us worry about crime or pollution, and some of us feel that the London school system is just too competitive for our child. But we're also all aware of how the property market works in the southeast, and many of us worry about the financial implications of bailing out. So today, I'm delighted to welcome two experts from Brewin Dolphin, one of the UK's leading wealth management companies, David Quintrell and Emma Cowley, and they'll explain how property, school, and location choices made now might look from a wealth perspective in 10 years' time. David will be a familiar face to some of you, as this is his fourth Parents Forum. He's a director of Brewin Dolphin, and his expertise covers a wide range of financial planning areas, including tax-efficient investment, pension and retirement planning, investment planning, inheritance tax planning, and trusts and offshore investments. New to the forum is Emma Cowley. She's a divisional director, and her focus is on investment management. She works with family lawyers, accountants, IFAs, and private clients to help create financial security for the future. So just a bit of housekeeping. There'll be a short presentation from Brewin running around the issues, and then we'll have a Q&A. Please start posting your questions about anything you'd like to ask in the Q&A box at the bottom as soon as people start talking, and our panel will try and answer them straight away. The session will be recorded and available as usual later today. So over to you, David. David, you're muted.
There we go. I shouldn't have joked earlier about joining calls after a year of being on websites without being able to unmute. So let me just get my screen up for you. Sorry, having technical issues. So hopefully that's coming over now. Perfect. So as I say, thanks very much for joining us this morning. Thank you for your patience in the last 35 seconds. We hope you're all looking forward to children returning from 2 or 3 arduous weeks at school for the same amount of period at the Easter holidays. Over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, Emma and I will run through some of the key financial implications in deciding whether or not to relocate before taking questions. This is very much a summary of the considerations which need to be accounted for rather than a deep dive, so to speak, and is designed really to give you food for thought around this very wide-ranging topic. We're very happy to take questions in the chat throughout and the Q&A under separate cover after the event, if that's helpful. Just turning to the next slide. Sorry, I think the PowerPoint's, there we go. So by way of quick introduction, Brewin's was established in 1762. We're one of the largest independently owned investment managers in the UK. We have over £46 billion of funds under management, 33 offices across the UK and Channel Islands, and a long history of working in partnership with our clients and their professional advisors to achieve financial planning solutions as unique as each client's needs.
David, before you go on, I'm just going to tell you, for some reason we're seeing the PowerPoint twice. We've got.
Oh, okay. How odd. How's that? Is that better?
No, yeah, that's it. Now we're just seeing it on its own.
Okay, sorry. No props. Moving on slightly. So in essence, Emma and I will be covering the financial implications of 3 scenarios: moving out of London and upsizing, moving out of London and freeing up a lump sum, and staying in London. There are broadly similar considerations across all 3 scenarios and a number of questions that parents will be asking themselves throughout the process. I don't propose to cover all of these immediately. We'll cover cover them in more detail later. But essentially, really, each of the considerations is to look at perhaps how you cover the school fees. Does it change from being income and savings or family assistance? What are our motivations for the move? Is it lifestyle? Is it a particular choice of school? Is it the finances? And thirdly, what are the financial implications that one should consider? Is it a short-term focus on the cost of moving, lower costs of living, cheaper schools, and what will the impact on long-term financial objectives be? As I say, before looking at those in more detail, Emma's going to provide a really helpful summary of some of the basic considerations that we should be looking at, not just in these scenarios, but actually in our day-to-day financial lives.
Thank you. So just a little bit of background on me. I'm an investment manager. So my day job means that I spend a lot of time researching the risks of a decision. Now, typically it's the financial risks around an investment decision, but the mindset works for a lot of things. I moved out of London a few years ago. Originally, I'm a country girl. I grew up on a farm. So I knew eventually I would want to leave central London, but I did get very used to having everything I could potentially want or need on my doorstep. So on considering the move, as you might expect, I spent a lot of time working through the pros and cons and doing my due diligence on things like commuting times and costs and options to get to the station. And we had spreadsheets of numbers on various different options. I know I took it a bit too far. You can't research everything. And whilst the decision does need to involve a certain amount of emotion, you have to love the house, the area, the schools, etc. But the financial side of it all really shouldn't be ignored. And before we go into some detail on various possible scenarios, I think it's probably good practice to just take a little bit of a step back and make sure that we encourage you to look at the big picture. So when thinking about moving house and schools, it can easily take over your life. And I think it's really important to remember that whilst it feels all consuming, and it is the biggest decision that you're going to want or need to make at the moment, your life and your situation is bigger. And so it's best to look at it all and try not to neglect anything. I am aware that many of you are going to be at different stages of life. Some of you will be avid plan makers and some of you will not. And you're probably all at very different points in this decision-making process. But please bear with me. I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. So you might be totally aware of some of this, but even if you live your life through a spreadsheet like I do, I think it's always good to be reminded of some of this, as it might highlight some tweaks that you might want to make. So let me ask you a few questions that I want to make sure that you're asking yourselves. Do you know what your monthly spending is? And have you got a good handle on what is coming into your bank account and what is going out, and also where it's going to? Your monthly spending is likely to vary a lot at the moment, given the various iterations of lockdown. And this is probably one of the things that will change if you do decide to move. So assess what you've got going out of the bank account and where it's going. Knowing what you've got coming in and going out is really important because it's going to show you what capacity or headroom you have. Now, how you use this capacity will be determined by your goals, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. Do you have a regular savings habit? You know, maybe you've been really diligent and making use of savings and ISA allowances in the run up to this decision. You might have a lump sum or savings that you've always earmarked for this move. But will that savings habit, will it have to drop a little bit to make this move happen? Or will you have to temporarily stop saving altogether? How is that going to affect your bigger picture long term if potentially you have to reduce your savings or take a break from them altogether? Do you have a rainy day fund? Is it enough? I know that a lot of us in this situation are really tempted to push ourselves as far as we can go and really stretch ourselves to make this dream happen. But you need to be mindful of the shocks that can occur. So if you know what your essential monthly spending is, you can build up a sufficient rainy day fund. And we would normally suggest that between 12 and 6 months of essential spending is kept in cash away from the current account, but easily accessible. Now, this is going to earn next to nothing in interest for the foreseeable future, but that's not what this part is about. This is about fixing the emergency without having to worry about how you're going to pay for it. And ahead of a move, I would suggest that you build up a contingency fund as well. In my experience, the contingency fund when you move house is never enough. Even with the best due diligence, the costs will end up being higher than you imagined. Now, there's obviously insurance policies that you can buy to help absorb some of these potential shocks, such as not being able to work for a period of time, for example. Now, every insurance obviously comes with a cost, but it can provide peace of mind that outweighs this. And everyone's going to be different in this respect. So my advice is to have your situation reviewed by us or other wealth advisors, and we can go through those insurances with you to see what might be suitable or appropriate for you in your situation. So just going back to these questions, what are your long-term goals? Do you have a plan to achieve them? Again, some of you will have a firm plan and others might be freewheeling a little bit more. You have to do what is right for you, but please do keep an eye on the future. The decision to move or stay put is obviously on the horizon for all of you, but don't forget to remind yourself of what your long-term goals are, or make some if you don't have some already. When planning for the longer term, it's really important to start as early as you can, because then you give those funds the best possible chance at growth. Now, this might sound a little bit off topic, but using money now to fund the move or the school fees rather than saving for the long term can have a big impact on what that longer term then looks like. So before potentially busting the bank to make this immediate term goal happen, please do reach out to us or others that in our roles so that we can make sure that your longer plans can cope. Because if this decision means that you might need to work for a few extra years, longer than you'd planned, wouldn't you prefer to know that now so that you can make it part of the decision process rather than it being a potential shock down the road? So if you can answer these questions, then it should put you in a stronger place to stand when it comes to making the decision of to move or to stay put. Now, what will you be considering? If we can move on to the next slide, please. So this list is not exhaustive, but there's some specific things that you do need to price up and budget for when you're considering either a move or staying put. Obviously, school fees are going to vary between London and non-London, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment. There's also the cost of moving that they don't really talk to you about on those TV shows, the property shows, if you watch them. You know, stamp duty, mortgage rates, the running cost of a new home, they might be vaguely obvious. But recently, for example, I had to learn all about cavity filling walls because it turns out that the house we bought is lacking in this area and it costs an absolute fortune to heat. So when you view a property, it can be really, really easy to fall in love and not see the features that come with added costs that you might not have experienced before. Also, you know, will your furniture fit, or are you going to have to budget to change that or buy more? Does the property need new kitchen? Maybe you want to put your mark on it or completely redevelop it. Get a good idea of what those sort of changes will cost, and also, are you going to be able to live in the property while those changes are happening? Because you need to consider budgeting for rental property if that's going to be needed. If you are thinking about a big project, maybe consider factoring in the cost of an architect, because whilst that might seem like an additional cost that you could do without, it might actually help with the overall cost or complexities of the project in the longer term. Travel time and costs might have been the first thing that you thought about when considering this potential move. You know, how long is it going to take to get from door to desk? Will that mean that you won't be able to work the hours in the office that you would normally do? Will that be a problem? What if you can't work on the train because of poor signal or nowhere to sit or no privacy? Will you need more or different cars? How much does it cost to park your car near the station? Is that car park safe? Does that mean that your car insurance might change if the car is in a public car park for the majority of the day? I know I'm firing a lot of questions at you right now, and I don't have all the answers. And this list, as I said, it's not exhaustive, but I'm just trying to arm you with the thought process that will hopefully help you with making this decision. I'm not suggesting that you get lost in the detail, but I think it's good practice to have a think about what life is going to look like and challenge and question every point to see how that might impact costs or your bottom line. You know, some of these things are just kinks that you might want to iron out once you've made the move, but some of it might throw up issues that you might not otherwise have seen. Finally, but obviously not finally, childcare costs. If you have younger children of preschool age, what's the nursery availability like? What hours are they open? Is that going to be realistic if you're both working and commuting? So the decision will be a balance between what you can afford to pay now, but also how much it will cost you in the longer term. So if we move on to the next slide, how much will you need to pay? Again, not an exhaustive list, but certainly things that you need to factor in. And this comes back to what I said about the importance of knowing what your capacity is, or your headroom. You might choose to use that on a mortgage with bigger repayments, but remember that an education has a lot of add-ons. This data is from the 2020 Independent Schools Council annual report. There is a London and Southeast effect, but I probably didn't need to tell you that. In fact, I'm quite sure that you're probably all more familiar with these numbers than I am, because my daughter's only 2. But are you considering boarding or day school, or the ability to do both? You know, you might not need to live right next to the school that you pick, because it's not going to be like it is in London, where you have to live within 2 roads of the good school to get in. But we know it's not just the price of an education. It's the school uniform, the drum set, the hockey stick, the rugby tour to South Africa. These schools offer fantastic opportunities, but they do come with a price tag. So you're going to need to work out if your children are going to be gifted all-rounders, and then budget accordingly. And these are considerations regardless of how you're going to pay for it, whether it be through your own income, from help from grandparents, or from savings, etc. And these numbers do go up. They're not fixed costs, because inflation is a real thing here. So if we move on to the next slide, focusing in a little more on the school fees part of this, some of you might have a plan and will know how you're going to pay for it, but some of you might be asking yourself that question. And so I'm going to run through just some of the options, and it might be that you end up using a combination of these. So you may be in a position to pay as you go from income. And if you decide to move out and therefore school fees go down as a result, then this might mean that you have more of that capacity that we talked about earlier, or that headroom. So going back a bit, that might mean that you can afford to pay a bit more on the mortgage each month, and therefore you might consider the bigger move. Alternatively, this headroom might go towards saving for your future, or maybe for your children's future, by using junior ISAs, for example. Maybe you've been using your ISA allowances each year and you've built up a pot of savings, and this is going to be what helps you fund the school fees. Now, for those of you who are a little bit further away from this decision, ISAs are a great way to save for the future, because there's no tax on any returns once the funds are within the ISA, and you can make tax-free withdrawals from them at any time. Investment bonds might also be an option. These can be tax efficient, but they're not one size fits all, I'm afraid. So again, if you want to explore these, please speak to us or another advisor to see if it might be suitable. Pensions could be another option, but given that you need to be 55 before you can make withdrawals, and this goes up to 57 in 2028, they might not be an immediate option. I think it's also worth considering that if you use that money to pay for school fees, is that going to have an impact on your own retirement? You can also use other assets, so maybe consider a loan against investments or property. And grandparents might be able to help, and that's obviously great news if they can. If they're willing to pay some, or if you're really lucky, all of the school fees, then this can take the pressure off the bank of mum and dad, but it can also be a sensible inheritance tax planning strategy for them. So if you were afraid of asking for help from your parents, try and spin it that not only are they helping you and their grandkids out, it could also be good for them from an IHT perspective. There's also protection policies, and we've touched briefly on these. They obviously rely on something not particularly nice happening so that they can kick in, but they can take the pressure off in a situation where you might find yourself unable to work, for example. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it covers the main options that we talk to clients about when they're in similar situations. It's actually really hard to give specific advice when we don't know much about each individual on the call. You know, obviously you could buy a lottery ticket each week, and then if you get lucky, the lottery winnings can pay for the school fees and all of this goes away. But then you might have other decisions to make. A more realistic suggestion would be to please get in touch with us or with your current wealth advisor if you have one, and work through a bespoke plan for your personal situation. But if you go on to the next slide, please. If you do the sums and work through the iterations and it doesn't all quite add up, maybe consider some ways that you can make some savings. Now, this isn't cutting corners. It's about doing what is right for you and your family and making the most of what you have and not putting unnecessary stress and pressure onto yourselves. So maybe consider starting private school a little bit later, so from 7 or from 11 or just for the sixth form. This is going to change the sum significantly. And remember that outside of London, the good non-fee paying schools don't have the same tiny catchment areas. Maybe explore bursaries or scholarships or sibling discounts. I know you all want to do the absolute best you can for the kids, but what is right for one might not be right for the other. So that's just something else to consider as well. And now I'm going to hand back to David.
Thanks, Emma. So just moving on to sort of practical examples. I was reasonably fortunate in the sense that clients of mine were going through this process at the tail end of last year. The COVID-related way of life, so to speak, had given them plenty of reasons to reevaluate their lives, what they were going through, and I suppose to some extent wanting to decide what they were going to do with their lives and how they wanted to live as a family going forward. So we thought it would be quite useful to use their situation to provide an example of the thought process and the thinking behind some of those options and the advantages and disadvantages, mainly from a financial perspective, and in coming to a decision about relocating or otherwise. Obviously, like all good weekly magazine stories, anonymity of participants is assured. So I haven't used their real names, but I've chosen two apparently at random, just for the purposes of this session. Needless to say, everybody's circumstances are different, as are their views and motivations for deciding to opt for any one of those three scenarios that we'll run through. Hopefully this example will help contextualize some of the points raised at outset and as just covered off by Emma. So very briefly, David and Emma are married in this example, 45 and 42 with two children aged 10 and 8. Both are currently at fee-paying school in London, and the combination of those two fees is just under 11,250 per term. Emma earns £115,000 a year, and with a bonus, David 37.5. So their net average income per annum is about 120,000 or so. Primary residence worth 1.4 million with an outstanding mortgage of 220,000, and they therefore have just under 1.2 million pounds of equity in their current property. Cash savings, and investment ISAs are about 320,000, split roughly equally for what it's worth. And looking at longer term aspects, because that's one of the things that is a really important consideration. Their pension provision, both by default kick in at 65. Emma's in a final salary pension scheme, which is quite unusual nowadays. Those are a dying breed. And David is in Nest, which is the basic sort of auto enrollment scheme. But one of their objectives is to retire before 65 if possible. Essential expenditure net of school fees is around 3,000 a month at 36,000. If we throw in the school fees, they're paying around 81,000 a year to live. Net of holidays, they're able at the moment to save around £30,000 a year, which is obviously what they're looking at for long-term savings, retirement planning, and an emergency buffer if car blows up or boiler explodes, that they've got those monies to utilise. Protection policies for earnings and lump sum in the event of ill health or death are provided through their respective employers. And all three scenarios that we've laid out here are being considered or were being considered at the time. Scenario one, so just going through really in more detail the advantages and disadvantages and some of the things that they were thinking about in terms of moving out of London and upsizing. So certainly as far as the school fees and those being provided are concerned, what I've done in this on the slides is to highlight in bold the real key parts of the considerations that the clients were focusing on. So although the others are listed, they weren't necessarily as high a priority for my clients in deciding what they wanted to do. So in essence, the fact that school fees could continue to be covered from existing savings and income was fine. That was unlikely to change as a result of some of the things we'll come on to. motivations were key, and I think in the discussions with the client, there are certain things you can talk about, and you can put yourself in their shoes. What you can't do is put yourselves in their head and how they want to live their lives and how they see them living their lives and bringing up the children and so on is really key to get that from them. And their three of the four motivations were effectively looking at their lifestyle choice, the forever home, the ability to get the house that they would effectively be carried out in a box of. Targeted school wasn't necessarily a consideration as such. I think it was more about the lifestyle move out of London, and the cost of schooling was a consideration, mainly because it would have an impact on some of their long-term savings. In terms of the primary financial considerations, and apologies if some of these seem blatantly obvious, but sometimes they're not. It was really looking at the cost of moving, the cost of borrowing if they were going to up the mortgage, costs of any renovation or work that needed doing on the house that they would find, running costs and travel costs, obviously moving out of London, but in this example, the two clients were able to work from home and wouldn't need to change their job or their location, but they would need to travel into town occasionally. Budgeting, again, as Emma was saying before, budgeting is really key, regardless of what your situation is and how that changes over time. And really looking at the long-term financial plan for them and their children. So a bit more detail in the middle section now in terms of what their motivations were. Certainly in terms of lifestyle choice, it was really the classic country life versus city living. But they'd lived in London pretty much all their lives. And I think we're looking for the proverbial bit more green space, in a lovely way, maybe a slower pace of life and village life, so a bit of a quieter, more community-led, village-led life. They looked at the market and had found a home they felt could be their forever home for 1.75 million, so slightly more expensive than their London property, but not significantly more so. And really getting a work-life balance, having the kids at home. And I think maybe if they're anything like me, they may feel differently over the January and February, after the January and February lockdown, about having had the kids at home in dark, cold and wet weather. But at the time we were speaking in December, having the kids at home for those 9 months and just being able to spend a little more time with them had really caused them to have a think about what relocation could do for them. The forever home they'd found in a village, more green space, a bit more land, a bigger garden, closer to woodland and those sorts of things. So again, the sorts of things that they really wanted for their kids and for them in potentially an old age. And the cost of schooling, again, motivation, just as Emma was saying, the cost of schooling differs, and there is that London and South East effect. So their school fees would have dropped by roughly £2,900 a term to just under 9, from just under 12 to just under 9. Other financial considerations are considerable, and as Emma was saying, it's not often that estate agents show you around the house and the first thing they say is the stamp duty on this is X, or renovation costs are Y. This is the house. Don't you love it? What will you pay for it? And the costs of moving are considerable, and the costs of moving here include the stamp duty. So on the stamp duty alone on a property of 1.75 million is 6 figures. So the cost of renovation is also on top. So it would have cost them around £140,000 if they were going to move. The cost of borrowing more, they weren't necessarily looking to borrow as much as they could to keep some of the savings back. They were effectively saying, actually mortgage repayment's been a really important part of our financial objectives. So we'll borrow what we need to buy the house, but nothing more. So the mortgage was effectively meeting the difference between their £220,000 that they had and the costs, another £350 on top. And that would have seen the mortgage repayments go from just under £1,000 a month now on a repayment basis to just under £2,500 a month, so around £1,600 a month more expensive. Running costs, it was a reasonably modern property, so they weren't expecting to have all the upkeep of a large, cold stone cottage or whatever. So they felt that would be around £150 a month more. Travel costs not significant in terms, but coming back into London once once, twice a month, something like that, maybe around £750, £800 per annum. And the consideration that they thought about was letting out, keeping their property in London and letting that out, and then renting in the Cotswolds, just to see what country life was like. So again, what they thought they could get was around £2,800 a calendar month for the rent in London, and the cost of the property they wanted, or a similar property they wanted in the Cotswolds, was around £3,000 a month. So a slight net difference. So part of the consideration is, as we say, and I know it doesn't sound necessarily particularly exciting talking about long-term planning and long-term financial plans, because much of day-to-day life is about the here and now, especially in the last 12 months. But it's really important to look at the impact of these short-term changes on what that meant for their long-term objectives, especially around retirement. So in essence, if they traded properties, and what I mean by that is if they sold London and bought in the Cotswolds on the basis of the research they'd done, the £9,500 of school fees saved would have been offset by the increase in mortgage payments at around £20,000 a year, plus running costs, plus travel. So the ability for them to save, they were saving around £30,000 a year, subject to one-off expenditure, is cut by around a third. Another consideration is and I'll come on to some of the implications of that in the long run. In terms of the impact of moving and covering the costs of moving, one of the things they need to think about is how long it would take them to recoup the £140,000 of costs in moving, the stamp duty, and the renovation. And obviously, if their ability to save on an annual basis is cut by a third, they were looking at around 6 to 7 years, if earnings and all things were equal, to recoup the costs of moving and the renovation, and just to look at the psychological impact of that, if you don't want to put it onto the mortgage. And it also changed the emphasis on where excess income is saved. Would they want to start to recoup those costs and build up savings again, or having spent so long trying to get the mortgage down to a reasonably low loan to value, is that now the main priority? Is that the focus for the next 4, 5, 6 years? So although they're recouping the costs, they're doing so by paying down the debt. Or actually, is it a bit of a perfect compromise? Is it looking at paying down some of the debt? Is it saving into pensions and ISAs and investments to try and make that money work hard and get better returns than the cost of the debt? Fortunately, in their circumstances, there's no change in pension provision or their pension position. The contributions are paid from salary into the employer schemes, and that will carry on as it is. So it doesn't require any significant change there. No change in what the retirement numbers look like or the retirement age. And I think just running through this scenario with them, having the backup, if you like, of equity in the new house, because they weren't stretching themselves to borrow as much as possible, actually gave them a bit of a backup to have excess value or excess capital in the property, to be able to fall back on that if it was ever needed, if there was problems with job loss, or they required those monies for some purpose, or even upsizing in the future, or further upsizing. Gave them a bit of reassurance. They weren't sort of throwing all of their eggs into the relocation basket financially. And one of the discussions we also had was around renting, and we wondered out loud whether renting would simplify the situation. It's not an irrevocable change. So to be able to move down to the Cotswolds, see what it looks like, see what the living is like, does it give them the lifestyle that they thought? Does that dream come true, or is it actually much of a muchness, or worst case scenario, it's the proverbial nightmare? So renting, after obviously taking off letting fees and tax for letting out fees, we did the maths, and there's around £500 to £600 a month net cost for renting, letting out London and renting in the Cotswolds. But it gives them that chance to see what it's like. And if it's a short-term move, if they rent for a year, then it's cost them £6,000 in £7,000 of net cost to see that lifestyle. but not put them in a position of having spent 140 grand plus the upheaval of moving, plus moving the kids' schools, to find out that life was the proverbial nightmare. Equally, one of the considerations was what the comparative property returns might be. So looking at property in financial terms, looking at the London property bubble or London property market versus the regions. And I think one of the accusations that Londoners, and I said it having been my whole life, is that Londoners think London is the centre of the universe, and everything in London goes up faster than anything else. And I don't have the stats to back that up with me, but I know there's generally a perception that is the case, and that's an important consideration to them, especially given the borrowing and the ability potentially for them to keep an asset which is going to grow faster than one they move into, with those costs, and then what that looks like in terms of their options in retirement. And we'll come on to scenario 3 in due course. So there's a broad summary of moving out of London and upsizing. Secondly, moving out of London and releasing a lump sum. So this is effectively the same move, but actually focusing on maybe the finances a bit more. So not looking to upsize in the sense of buy a bigger property or spend more money, but actually saying, okay, can we still find a place we want to be in that meets all our requirements for that lifestyle, but actually release some of the capital and some of the profit we've made on our house in London, and use that for school fee planning or some of our longer term objectives. So just moving back to the left hand side, looking at the motivations and the lifestyle choice and the cost of schooling, and the primary financial considerations are really no different to the slide before: cost of moving, borrowing, renovation costs, running costs, etc. Motivations remain country life versus city living. The one big difference is the property value is lower. They would have had the ability to take roughly £250,000 out of the sale to the purchase. Work-life balance remains the same, but the biggest difference is that actually that £250,000 enabled them, or would have enabled them, to pay off the mortgage, and that enables them to give serious consideration to being able to bring forward retirement. And with pensions at 65, actually to decide whether to bring that forward to 62, 60, 58, whatever it may be. Cost of schooling they were looking in the same area, so the cost of schooling difference is the same. The cost of moving is still considerable, still 5 figures at 50,000, but obviously the stamp duty is that much less. Renovation, they'd sort of earmarked £25,000 for doing the bathroom and decoration, so to make it what they wanted rather than a wholesale change. The cost of borrowing in terms of financial considerations is gone. The mortgage would have been repaid, so they don't have that £220,000 debt, and they've effectively got another £1,000 a month in their proverbial pocket. Running costs were a little bit higher, but not significantly, so about 2/3 of scenario 1. And travel costs are the same, again, same area, same responsibility, and same wanting to get back into London. So we looked at how that might affect their long-term plans. Essentially, the savings in school fees and through the repayment of the mortgage, offset by the increase in running and travel costs, effectively resulted in a net saving of around £19,000 a year. So the ability for them to save increases by that much. Now, the implication, obviously, we're talking about releasing a lump sum. They could have decided to keep the mortgage at 220 and had 250,000. And for all intents and purposes, although the mechanics of saving that and what that could do for financial planning and their financial objectives isn't identical, it's near as damn it the same. So it's a bit of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Again, considerations: how long to recoup £75,000 of moving cost and potential renovation. Scenario 1, we were looking at 6 to 7 years based on them if all they were doing was saving to recoup that cost. Here you're looking at nearer 3.5. But actually the additional saving, and looking at the impact of that additional saving, if they'd saved that £19,000 a year on a monthly basis and invested it with reasonably conservative returns of 4% per annum, depending on risk profiles, etc., but looked at what that could have brought them by the age of 60, it would give them around about a lump sum of 330,000. Now, the reason I've used the monthly savings rather than the lump sum is because the lump sum invested with the power of compounding between now with David at 45 and David at 60 at 15 years actually produces a much more significant sum, because you're starting earlier, as Emma was talking about earlier. So I've used the monthly sum being invested on the annual savings being invested on a regular basis, because it produces a lower return, but it still shows the impact of what that could do for them in terms of pulling retirement further towards them and retiring at age 60, not 65. So at 60, if that £19,000 was saved on a regular basis, growing at 4% per annum, would produce around £330,000 of capital. Now, if we go back to square one and look at what their outgoings are at around £36,000 a year, ignoring school fees, maybe 46 to 50 if they go on luxury holidays, they could simply get to 60, take that 330,000 and say, right, divide it by 50,000. There's 6 years. That would see them through to 65 without having to touch their pensions, assuming in real terms that everything stayed the same. And that's a really strong pull to actually potentially put the financial considerations further up the priority list, because it conceivably brought retirement forward, or could have brought retirement forward potentially more than the 5 years that I've touched on here. Actually, it could be 6, 7, or 8, especially with the lump sum being invested and compounding. Again, changes the emphasis potentially on where that excess income is saved. Debt repayment is ignored because they don't have any. And then it's really about investment, and I'll come on to some of the options for investment and the way that we look at that just towards the end. Again, no change in pension position. And they've got the ultimate backup, if you like, of having a debt-free house. So if Armageddon really came and they did need capital from the property, they've got the ability to withdraw it, and they've got 100% of the capital as theirs. Moving on to the final scenario, staying in London. In essence, it's probably the easiest choice to make, and nobody really likes change, I guess. So just being conscious of time and importance of getting through Q&A. Again, lifestyle choice. The targeted school, they'd chosen the school that their kids were at outset, so they had already taken care of that. So the motivations around it were really saying, okay, well, actually, we actually quite like our life anyway. We're not wholly unhappy with city living and our lifestyle. No change equals no hassle. And they were broadly on track to retire before 65 based on the ability for them to save anyway. They targeted the current schools, as I've said, and are very happy with them. The other considerations in terms of the finances were if they did stay in London, they might look at spending money on the property, so that adding an extension at the back, so that would have cost around 60,000. But in essence, no change to school fees, mortgage repayments, or day-to-day running costs. So it's really about continuing to use budgeting to ensure everything remains on track. The only discussion really around here was the best way to fund the extension, and that was whether they look at adding to the mortgage, given that mortgage rates are at historic lows, or from excess cash, given that savings rates are at historic lows. And again, they still have the backup of being able to access the equity in the house, and also to cover off the pension provision and so on if needs be. In terms of how to put those things into context and actually sort of see what the most important part of planning could be, at least in terms of putting a picture, and they say a picture tells 1,000 words. A key part of the planning process is cash flow forecasting. And for those of you who've seen a couple of the other sessions we've done before, we've explained we use cash flow analysis and cash flow forecasting to help establish what the implications of a particular course of action might be. So here it would be relocation. And the results of that cash flow forecasting enable us to demonstrate what you might need to save and invest, or might need to do to replace the cost of moving, payment of school fees, but not to affect long-term retirement plans, or actually to accept that it does affect long-term retirement plans. So for David and Emma, for example, it might have been that the impact, if they decided to buy a £3 million house and borrow that much more and use all their savings, that actually they did retire at 65. But they would have done that knowing that they were comfortable saying we're happy to retire at 65. The lifestyle and the way that we bring up the kids and have our family life is more important to us than being able to retire at 58 when the kids will have moved out and will have their own lives potentially at that point in time. And actually it helps us consider the options available to you or to clients in terms of where and how best to use those assets to achieve the objectives. Ultimately, the most important thing when it comes to financial planning is that you put into place a plan that is the right one for you, for your unique circumstances, aims and objectives, all things considered, and especially here around the costs of relocating and educating your children. Touching on a few of the points raised by Emma, key is really to ensure that those objectives are met as far as possible, and that can be done through amongst other things, the five topics in the circles here, looking at income protection or life insurance to protect in the event of something particularly unpleasant happening to you, looking to make use of existing savings, either how to fund school fees in the move or how to utilize savings and excess income going forward, establish that savings plan and get the right balance between investing for growth but not taking too much risk, looking at access and control and flexibility so that you can get money when you need to, but it grows well and tax efficiently when you don't. Again, help from the grand bank, so to speak, for families fortunate enough to have parents in a position where they can help with some or all of the school fees. Really good planning from an IHT perspective for them, but also really good planning for you. And actually thinking in the round, and I appreciate those three scenarios, we've sort of gone through a reasonably large amount of information in a short period of time. That multifaceted approach, looking at the combination of earnings, existing savings, future cash flow, and so on, can help bring everything into the round and ensure that everything is as it should be as far as your savings are concerned. Very briefly, when it comes to savings, it's really important to make it as tax efficient as possible and use as many allowances as possible. Ultimately, every individual in the UK has by default just under £30,000 or £27,800 of tax-free income and capital gains allowances that can be used every year, a £20,000 annual allowance for ISAs, which is a tax-free savings account, and the ability to have up to £1.073 million in a pension. As I'm sure you would expect me to say, and as I'm sure you're aware, tax-efficient planning has a really powerful effect on your long-term plans and shouldn't be underestimated. In a nutshell, that's the end of the formal side of things. Be delighted to take any questions. And once I've worked out how to reverse the screen sharing, I will hand you back to Guy.
Great, David, and Emma, thank you both very much indeed. I'm now feeling well informed and slightly anxious. So we've had questions flooding in, both in the Q&A box and in the chat and beforehand as well. And what we're going to do now is try and get as many as we can answered in the 10 minutes or so we've got left. And do keep using the Q&A box, because Emma and David will type answers as well as talk, so that we can try and cover as much ground as possible. So the first thing I want to talk about is inflation, school fee inflation particularly, which always goes up, never goes down. And how do we ensure that our financial planning will mitigate against that risk? It's not really a risk, it's just a reality, isn't it?
I don't know if David's frozen or not. He looks very still, but I'll start, and if he wants to jump in, he can. Yeah, I'm not. I think is it? Do you know what the rough figure is for school fee inflation at the moment, or projected to be?
I think it was over 4% last year, but it's been a real term increase every year.
Yeah.
For as long
so. Yeah, so I think that this kind of highlights the point that if you've got a cash lump sum that you're thinking about using to pay for the school fees, obviously that's going to earn very little at the moment. So it's going to be eaten away very quickly as those school fee costs go up. One way to consider dealing sort of trying to keep pace, is that you can look at, rather than holding that money in cash, invest it in stocks and shares, or a diversified portfolio that is suitable for the individual, because then it's got the potential, certainly with the longer term time horizon, it's got potential to make more meaningful returns, which will hopefully, not every year is it going to be ahead of what, the figure that you've just quoted, but over a number of years on average, you should have the potential to make returns higher than that, so that hopefully that pot can keep pace with what you're having to spend, and it will give you much more opportunity to do it, rather than if it's just sat in cash, currently earning very little. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. On a similar, I think, but related question, someone's saying that they intend to pay for their children's school fee in university higher education, and they've got assets and income, but have no idea whether it will be affordable. So how do we start planning? I'd also add a slight addition to that question, which is, the government loans for university education seem to me quite a good deal. So should one be planning to pay for university education?
Shall I take that, Emma?
Yeah, go for it.
I will. So yeah, it's a difficult one. I suppose I'd split that into two parts. I mean, obviously the cash flow side of things, in terms of determining whether it's affordable, that's where the cash flow planning comes into play, because we can look at potential universities, whether it's Russell Group or whatever, and look at the costs of accommodation, tuition fees, and those sorts of things, and work out whether there's a shortfall in terms of what your savings would provide. The student loan side of things is probably the biggest conundrum that parents have when the children come out of university. It's a good deal in some respects, and certainly the costs of borrowing are reasonably low. The problem is, if you're not repaying it straight away, and you're not in a situation where it's going to be written off after X period of time, it can suddenly become a bit of a millstone, especially when your child is no longer A, legally a child, and B, they're in a position of looking at trying to borrow to get on the property ladder, and they've got that student loan and the costs outstanding. There's a really good summary of the pros and cons of paying off student loans on moneysavingexpert.com. It's Martin Lewis. So again, like all the advice we give, it's specific to that individual. That would be the same case for student loan repayment. But I would say, on average, if I could stereotype a client, most will look at the student loan and side of things as actually a way of it's a really good education piece. The child learns how to deal with debt and debt repayment and the responsibilities of budgeting and all those sorts of things. So
great. Different scenario now. Someone's got parents who could help, but they're worried about how much they can afford, and also whether they should be lending the money or giving them the money.
Probably two aspects here. I mean, if the grandparents essentially have got the money and they don't need it, and they can't foresee the opportunity, the situation where they would need it, then from an inheritance tax perspective, it makes much more sense for them to just make the gift, and then it's outside of their estate after 7 years, or conceivably immediately. Actually, if it's from excess income, there's a rule that does not require survival for 7 years. Equally, if they're not in a situation where they feel they can afford to give away all of the money, or that they don't want to, and they want a degree of control over the timing of these things, then lending the money puts control and keeps control of that from a grandparent perspective. It doesn't necessarily have to be lent with any interest. It can be interest free, but it's really boiling down to the circumstances of the grandparents to determining what the right course of action is.
Okay, so here's one that I think will be familiar to loads of London parents. We haven't got liquid assets at present to pay for education, and we're intending to stay put in London. And we think our home's gone up in value quite considerably since we bought it. I mean, it probably has, hasn't it? So what do we do? We borrow against the house to pay school fees, or?
I mean, yeah, I mean, essentially that's, maybe, I mean, if you're in London, you're really looking at trying to release equity from the property, and the two ways of doing that are to borrow, and obviously that has its own implications on financial objectives and day-to-day costs, as we looked at in one of the summaries, or conceivably looking to move to a different area, so release capital by moving to a cheaper house in a cheaper area and just release the capital without having to move out.
You slightly broke up there, David.
Oh, sorry. So mortgaging the property or moving, downsizing in terms of capital release are the only two ways really of doing that.
Can I ask just a question about your scenario that slightly surprised me? I thought the rental income on their London property seemed quite low for a property that was worth 1.4 million. Are there things you can do to your property to increase its potential rental income?
Yeah, so so that number came from them. So I didn't question it. They told me that's what they were going to get, so I left it. I mean, and you know doing enough to make it look a bit smarter, then that's conceivably worth, and that might add it might add a little bit more. Equally, if you've got something, it could be worth saying, okay, look, so they talked about doing an extension, so they could have done the extension. That's obviously going to add floor space, that's going to add value, and without sounding like Phil and Kirsty, that is going to increase the value of the property and also the rental value. So yeah, I'm going to be dropping them an email afterwards to see what they've done and get a new estate agent.
Yeah, well, the theory I've always heard is that extensions to give yourself more space outside of London, particularly the further out you go, you don't often get back what you put in. Whilst in London you nearly always do, don't you? That's kind of the big property theory. What about potential loss of earnings or lower bonuses and the volatility of the stock market? How on earth do you kind of spread everything around so that you can cover the cost of school fees?
It's probably a combination of both answering that. If on the volatility of the stock market, when you're investing, you've got to have a time horizon of sort of 3 to 5 years. Now that doesn't mean that we're anticipating if somebody says that they're trying to pay for school fees, we know that it's going to be over a period of time. So it's not that they're going to need that entire lump sum at one particular point in the future. So it comes down to the individual understanding what their appetite for risk is. That's a big part of it as well, to make sure that the investments are suitable, not only for what they want that money to be able to do, in this case, pay the school fees, but it's also got to be right for them. Because if you take yourself back 12 months, it did feel like the sky was falling, and all portfolios, whatever they were invested in, however the risk category, whatever the risk category was, they were down, and that caused a lot of quite considerable upset for some clients, as you would expect. So it's personal when we're creating a portfolio for someone on a number of levels. But yeah, you've got to be mindful of the fact when you're investing a lump sum which is designated for school fees, that it's got to be able to produce a certain amount at the various points in time. So you would factor that in to how you invest. But I know that David's probably going to want to talk about insurance policies alongside that, to sort of as it's a holistic plan when it comes to looking after school fees planning.
Yeah, and I think certainly as far as the Armageddon scenarios are concerned, it's not something we all like to think about. We don't want to think of our own mortality, and we don't want to think about things going wrong. But actually, that's why insurance exists, and it's far better to pay for insurance and have that peace of mind than it is potentially to sort of say, well, I'm saving myself 50 quid a month. So certainly that's the ultimate way of protecting finances, whether it's income or a lump sum or whatever. And as far as variable bonuses and all those sorts of things, again, without sounding sort of evangelical about cash flow planning, we can build all those things in. So we can build in and say, well, okay, what if I go back to Emma in the scenario? What if her bonus was 0? What impact does that have in any 1 year, and all those sorts of things? And the same goes as we were talking about when my Wi-Fi froze. We're talking about school fee inflation. building in the scenario that actually school fee inflation is 5% a year, although it's not at the moment, versus earnings inflation of 2%. Again, what does that look like, and how does that impact on savings over the next, for David and Emma, over the next 10 years while the kids go through senior school and sixth form, so to speak?
Okay, so final question. We are running a bit over time now. I'm just going to make it.
Sorry.
Go back to make it personal, really. In your own cases, how do you relate to this question? Emma's talked at the beginning about making the move. Was it the right thing to do? Do you see advantages to being in the city or in the country, or financially as well as personally?
I'm probably always going to be a little bit biased with this because, like I said, I grew up on a farm, and when I lived in London, I was right in the city, so it was so far removed from where I grew up. It was great, I loved it, but I was always going to move at some point. It was just, I guess, to where and when. Right, and again, you've got to apply a filter, I think, because if you think about the last 12 months, if you've been outside of London and had the luxury of having green space on your doorstep, then it's been great compared to not having that. It's a difficult one for me to put myself in that position because schools weren't a consideration for me when I made the move. It turns out that we've managed to move right opposite the best primary school in the area, but kind of happy accident. Davis, given that his kids are a little bit older and he has had this consideration, do you develop the house, extend it, or move? He might be able to give you a more balanced answer.
Yeah, so my parents, so I'm in southeast London. My parents-in-law live in Bradford-on-Avon down in Wiltshire. So we had a bit of a conundrum about what to do. My eldest is 11, and we decided to stay put, do a loft extension, which started a month before lockdown and finished about 3 weeks ago, and I just decided to stay put. And I guess my financial hat was on. I think we were, the cost of moving was not dissimilar to 4 or 5 years of school fees for my eldest. And I ultimately, I don't like, personally, I'm not a big fan of change. It takes me a long time to get my head around it. So we'll probably end up moving when she's graduated at university. And anyway.
Yeah, no, I live in London, and I'm quite happy to stay put for fairly similar reasons to you, actually. Great. Well, thank you both very much for that. Our next one is in a few weeks' time after the Easter holidays, and it's on the great outdoors, learning outside the classroom. And then on May the 4th, we've got an evening one on senior boarding in action. We're going into boarding houses and seeing, and the idea is that you can attend with your children and ask boarders and house parents how it works. And then the following 2 weeks after that, on May the 18th, we've got a session on preparing your child to thrive at boarding school. So just thank you all very much, and see everybody after the Easter holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.